Hello, I'm Nicholas Clark, and today I will be talking about the CSVLOD model and its significance to enterprise architecture. Now, kind of before we get into that specifically, I think we should probably lay down like a good foundation so we can really build up to why the model itself is important. And to do that, we first need to start with enterprise architecture as a whole and sort of different conceptualizations of what enterprise architecture is. So, what makes up enterprise architecture? Well, it's kind of the way in which we conceptualize it is what enterprise architecture is. And right now, there's two popular conceptualizations I kind of want to look at. So, first, we have enterprise architecture as business, data, application, and technology architecture, and enterprise architecture as roadmap, current state, and future state. Now, that might just sound like a jumble of words right now, which, I mean, it kind of is, but hopefully we can walk through these and you'll kind of understand why these are important to segue into CSVLOD. So, starting with that first one, we have enterprise architecture as four components: business architecture, data architecture, application architecture, and technology architecture. This is known as the BDAT stack. I wonder why. Basically, the problem with BDAT as a conceptualization is, it's not very clear cut. An EA artifact can describe multiple layers at once. And when I say EA artifact, I mean sort of like a document in relation to the organization. If we have an EA artifact with this sort of conceptualization, there's a chance that one artifact can fall into multiple layers. This is not good, because it's incredibly simplistic. We don't really want a simplistic model when the goal is to categorize incredibly complex information. Now, I'm not saying that we don't want it to be simple at all. What I'm saying is this is way too simplistic. Honestly, I think the best way to think about the problems with BDAT is summarized with a quote from Codicep, and it's that thinking about enterprise architecture in this way resembles thinking about cars as a mix of metal, plastic, glass, and rubber. True, but useless. Now we can look at enterprise architecture as two states and a roadmap: the current state, the future state, and the roadmap, which, as the figure indicates, the roadmap is the pathway between the current state and the future state. So, what are the problems with two states and a roadmap? I feel like it's a bit self-explanatory. One is that a lot of the really long-term future goals, or that entirety of the concept of a future state, may be completely undefinable at the moment. We might not actually know what that exact end goal is going to be. And this specific model, it's actually just nothing. There really isn't much more to say with that one. It's just it almost seems a little silly to me. And with that out of the way, what have we learned so far? Well, we've learned about two weak conceptualizations that are incredibly troublesome in practice. BDAT, which is confusing and hard to explain. And then two states in a roadmap, which is too simplistic and completely idealistic. And now we can get into the meat and potatoes of this presentation: the CSVLOD model. So why was all of that preface information so important? Well, it was important because the CSVLOD model was developed based on the fact that those two other models really were not incredibly sustainable. The CSVLOD model is a research-based model that's supported by empirics, industry practices, supported by actual organizational evidence. This model, it works to reflect and describe the business world as it is, rather than from, like I've said, almost a utopian perspective. So, looking forward, take a hard look at this figure I have on the screen. It seems pretty easy to understand. In fact, it's honestly almost self-explanatory, but I would like to use the rest of this presentation to sort of break down the specifics of why it's formatted the way it is. And we also get to learn a new word, so look forward to learning a new word. Alright, let's get cracking with this overview. There are two orthogonal dimensions. Ooh, of a CSVLOD model. What and how? There are 6 types of EA artifacts described in this model. Hint, CSVLOD, that's 6 letters. And some of the advantages to the CSVLOD model, including what I've said prior, are its key features and explanatory value, which is something that, honestly, I don't feel the other two had even remotely. So, what are these 6 types? We have 6 types, and they are considerations, standards, visions, landscapes, outlines, and designs. These 6 types of EA artifacts constitute the overarching CSVLOD model of enterprise architecture, providing the basis for what CSVLOD represents. It goes much more into depth than just to hear when put into practice. So let's start with talking about those 2 orthogonal dimensions. Dimension 1, it organizes all of the EA artifacts into rules, structures, and changes. And then dimension 2, it classifies all of the EA artifacts into business-focused and IT-focused. You've already seen all of that stuff coming up to this point. It's been in the presentation. But we're really going to get into depth here and talk about what each of these really mean. Okay, but if you're like me, you want to know what orthogonal means, you know what I'm saying? Now, orthogonal's definition, at least its first definition, is that it's intersecting or lying at right angles. Now, if you can see the figure below, which you've seen multiple times already, you can see where the phrase kind of orthogonal comes from if you look at the x and y axes of the figure. But that's neither here nor there. You will not be tested on the word orthogonal, and I don't really think it's that relevant, but I also think it's an important snippet of information, just in case you wanted to know. On with the show, however, Dimension 1, what? Now, what classifies EA artifacts based on what they describe? All EA artifacts can be classified into, as we've seen, rules, structures, and changes. Now, the rules, these describe general global rules defining an organization. Normally, they're expressed in text, and they apply uniformly over all instances of a certain type. For example, the rules define how a business practice should be done and how all IT systems should be implemented. Not just a specific system, a specific instant. It is sort of like the overarching methodology or line that you follow when doing these implementation. Now, rules are permanent. These rules, once implemented, they aren't discarded. They're here for the long haul. There's a chance that a rule might be discarded, but most of the time you'll find it to be modified or changed based on the needs of a company. They are the most stable, the foundation of all other decisions. When a decision is being made, the rules are at the forefront. And this happens to keep that consistency within an organization. Why is the decision made? We can always go back to our rules. Now, these rules, they're intangible, uncountable. What does that mean? So, think about it like this. If we have a rule that Linux needs to be installed on every computer in the organization, that number will always be fluctuating. The rule exists, but really it's sort of uncountable as it's in a state of constant flux, and that specific number really is not that important. When you think about rules, think about this quote from Enterprise Architecture, A Modern Approach to Business and IT Alignment by Kodasev. How do we want it to work? Structures, these describe high-level structures or its parts and are usually represented in a graphical format. A lot of times they refer to specific, relatively abstract instances, concrete capabilities, initiatives, processes, and they often describe the relationship between different instances rather than an overarching idea among instances. Like rules, these are permanent as well. Once a structure is in place, it stays. These are relatively stable, but once again change with an org and their plans. They provide high-level maps for facilitating decision-making, and they're tangible and countable. This is because they describe specific instances. Once again, when thinking of structures, Think of this quote from Kodasev. What approximately do we have or want to have? Now that brings us to changes. Pretty self-explanatory. They describe specific proposed changes. They are the tactical plans of an organization, and they are represented in a mix of graphical and textual formats. Typically, they're tangible, as they describe instances in great detail. But they are temporary because they are created with specificity and then discarded. Once they complete their task, they are no longer needed. And once again, Kodasev has a great quote for this one. What exactly are we going to change right now? And with that, congratulations, you have defeated Dimension 1, which brings us on to Dimension 2, How. This classifies EA artifacts on how they describe objects. All EA artifacts can be classified into IT-focused or business-focused. Starting with business-focused, it utilizes plain business language and is technology neutral. It covers, if it wasn't obvious, the business domain. But it might also cover other domains that are relevant to business. Business-focused EA artifacts provide brief, informal, and highly intuitive presentation formats, and only contain the most essential information. If it's business-focused, it's always dual EA artifact, aiming to facilitate collaboration. They are often interpreted as the communication interfaces between business and IT. This collaboration promotes understanding between organizations, and they're the pipeline of information. Now, when I say dual EA, essentially what I'm saying is that there are a minimum of two parties that are relevant to the artifact, whether it's through the developmental stage, the understanding stage, within the audience of the artifact. That's essentially what I'm saying with dual EA. Now, on the flip side is IT focused. This documentation is purely technical, highly specific language covering business systems related to specifically IT, related to architects. It helps architects organize the IT. These are intended for a specific audience within the IT department, usually highly specialized groups, and serve a specific purpose. Some traits include very hard and formal descriptions, incredibly detailed. A lot of the languages may be illegible to someone outside of the IT department. And with that, we are back to my favorite figure, the one figure that I love using throughout this presentation, but because it's a good figure, and now that we're looking back at it, we honestly have a much better view. So here, let's take this example, designs. As a change, we can see that a design is temporary and acts to forward a business and IT goal of some sort. But as it is IT focused, it's going to be much more technical, focused, and specific. This is going to be something that applies directly to possibly teams, possibly those more IT-oriented, tech-focused teams. It's going to be a little bit more hard to understand for someone outside of that specific position within the organization. But wait a minute, Nicholas. You might ask, what are these 6? Well, you keep mentioning them. You keep talking about them. This graphic says some interesting sentences about them. What are they really? Well, that's what we're going to talk about in this next section. But before we move on, I want to make something abundantly clear. These 6 are not the only forms that documents take. These are sort of general forms. Each one of these forms have subtypes, considerations, subtypes, visions, subtypes. You get the idea. So before we talk about them, let's talk about sort of what a subtype is. Subtypes. Each general type can have a variety of subtypes. Many organizations have unique subtypes, but narrow subtypes can be found across different organizations and are grouped into 3 categories. Essential EA artifacts, used in 50% or more of practices. These are subtypes that are incredibly common. They are like a cornerstone in most organizations. Common EA artifacts, used in 25 to 50% of established EA practices. You can find them around. They're pretty common, as the name implies. And the last one, if you would be surprised for me, uncommon EA artifacts, used in 10 to 25% of established EA practices. These are like the rares of artifacts. They all fall under the big 6, but they sort of serve niche roles within the big six that sort of differentiate them, and the uncommon ones are the ones least found. So, with the idea of subtypes in mind, let's get cracking at these 6 general types. Starting with considerations. Considerations are global conceptual rules, fundamental considerations important for the business, relevant to IT. They're dual EA artifacts, relevant to both business leaders and architects, and they focus on specific points in time, expressed in simple formats. Subtypes include principles, policies, and analytical reports. A principle being a global high-level guideline influencing all decision-making and planning in the organization, and analytical reports being executable analysis of relevant tech trends and their potential impact on business. Consideration represents the planning decisions on how an organization needs to work. They are developed at the top level and it influence all downstream architectural decisions. Up next, we have standards, global technical rules relevant to IT, mostly to architects. They don't really focus on a specific point in time and are expressed in various formats with a regulated notation. Subtypes include guidelines, patterns, and logical data models. Patterns being generic reusable solutions to commonly occurring problems in the design of IT systems, and logical data models being logical or even physical platform-specific definitions of common data entities and their relationship. Standards represent planning decisions on how all IT systems should be implemented, and play a large role in technical consistency. Visions, like the others, the name essentially tells you what it does. It's high-level conceptual descriptions from a business perspective, dual artifact, and focus on, of course, the long term. A lot of times, these are expressed in informal formats. Subtypes including roadmaps, target states, and context diagrams. Roadmaps being structured graphical views of all IT planned initiatives in specific areas, and context diagrams being a high-level graphical descriptions of the current flows of information within an organization. Visions represent mostly planning decisions and what IT should deliver to an org in the long run. Landscapes. I like this one. It's me for real because it focuses on the now, the current state of an organization. It is high-level technical descriptions of the IT landscape. It's expressed in a strict format and it's complex. And its subtypes include landscape diagrams, inventories, and enterprise system portfolios. Landscape diagrams being technical box and arrow schemes of different scopes and granularities describing the IT landscape. And enterprise system portfolios being structured high-level mappings of all essential IT systems to relevant business capabilities. Landscapes are the knowledge base of reference on the current IT landscape and help us understand, analyze, and modify the structure of our business landscape. Outlines, high-level descriptions of separate IT initiatives understandable to business leaders. These are dual EA artifacts, and they focus on the midterm future, 1 to 2 years ahead. They're sort of a mix of textual descriptions, simple diagrams, and in this case, subtypes include solution overviews, options assessments, and initiative proposals. Now, those should sound pretty self-explanatory, but we'll go over solution reviews, being high-level descriptions of specific proposed IT solutions, and then initiative proposals being pretty much the beginning of that, a very early idea-level description of proposed IT initiatives and their justifications. A solution overview would be a solution to a problem that exists within the organization, and an initiative proposal would come into play when you yourself or the IT sector of an organization spots sort of a hole and propose that they could fix it in a way. Outlines work to represent how specific IT initiatives should be implemented. They are then used to evaluate and approve specific IT initiatives. As temporary artifacts, they're produced in the early stages, then archived. These provide detailed technical and functional descriptions of separate IT projects for teams. They are dual artifact and relevant to project teams and architects. They are expressed as a mix of things: text, tables, complex diagrams, anything that is essential to get this program or project where it needs to be. Now, all of this is done through formal modeling notations, the example here being UML. That's not really important, but what is important is to know that a lot of the notation and way that information will be recorded on a project like this will be hyper-specific to that team. Subtypes including solutions designs and preliminary solutions designs. Solutions designs being technical and functional specifications of approved IT solutions actionable for project teams, and preliminary solutions designs, well, that's self-explanatory. It's simply the preliminary stage of solutions designs. Designs represent how exactly specific IT projects should be implemented by their IT teams. Now, after 21 minutes of grueling information intake, you have made it to the final summary. Now, let's dig into this mountain of information to wrap everything up. First, all EA artifacts can be classified into rules, structures, changes, and they can also be classified into business-focused or IT-focused. Never forget that diagram. It is incredibly useful. Considerations describe global conceptual rules and fundamental considerations. Standards describe global technical rules. Visions provide high-level conceptual descriptions from a business perspective. And landscapes provide high-level technical descriptions from an IT perspective. Outlines provide high-level descriptions of separate IT initiatives understandable to business leaders. And designs provide the highly technical descriptions of separate IT initiatives to project teams. And with that, we have made it through.